When Hammer Film Productions made The Man Who Could Cheat Death at the end of 1958, they were very much riding the crest of a wave. You know, they had reintroduced Gothic horror. As far as British cinema was concerned, they'd more or less invented Gothic horror with The Curse of Frankenstein, which had been a huge international hit in the summer of '57. A year later, their reinvention of Dracula, again, was a huge international hit, and as a result, the US majors were pretty much falling over themselves to, if you like, get into bed with this tiny little Thameside company. And at the time of The Man Who Could Cheat Death, United Artists had just added themselves to the roster by sponsoring The Hound of the Baskervilles. And with The Man Who Could Cheat Death, it was the turn of Paramount, who offered them a property they owned called The Man in Half Moon Street. The film, the Paramount original, had come out in 1944. Well, in point of fact, it came out at the beginning of '45. Curiously enough, it anticipated the release of an MGM version of The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is curious because the theme in each case was quite similar. Someone who in fact is extremely old, but somehow has contrived to retain the appearance of a young man. The Man in Half Moon Street, in fact, originated as a play by a writer called Barry Lyndon. And this play had opened at the end of March 1939 in the West End at the New Theatre. It subsequently moved to the Piccadilly, and it ran in all for something like 5 months. It came off, I think, in August 1939, just anticipating the beginning of the Second World War. And in this play, the Homo Immortalis, as he's called, was a character called John Thackeray. Now, it's interesting that Lyndon should use the name Thackeray because, of course, he had taken his own pen name, Lyndon was a pen name, Barry Lyndon, from Barry Lyndon, who was a character created by William Thackeray. And the part went in the West End production to a very popular actor of the period called Leslie Banks, who is still well known to horror fans for a little spell he had in Hollywood in 1932 when he played an arch-sadist lunatic called Count Zaroff in an RKO horror thriller called The Most Dangerous Game. In the Man in Half Moon Street, apparently his final collapse when he's deprived of the glands he requires and reverts to his real age was a moment of pure theatre achieved without makeup, apparently, purely by the force of the actor. It sounds a little bit like, you know, the famous late 19th century adaptations of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which characters like Richard Mansfield would, make their achievements purely through acting. And Leslie Banks's co-stars were Malcolm Keane, who played a character called Dr. Weiss, and the young Anne Todd, who played the heroine, who in the play is called Elizabeth Ryan. There was also a very popular actor of the day called Leslie Dwyer in the original West End cast. And at some point during that 5-month run, I'm not sure whether it was at the New Theatre or the Piccadilly, I think it was at the New Theatre, a young man of 17 called Christopher Lee dropped in to see that play and was very, very impressed by it. And I'm sure he had no notion at that point that just 19 years later he'd be appearing in a rather loose adaptation of it for a British film company. When Barry Lyndon wrote The Man in Half Moon Street, I'm sure he was aware of the Gothic archetype of the wandering Jew, who's the character who's condemned to live forever unless he can offload his curse onto someone else. And, this was an idea that had been turned into one of the great Gothic novels by the Irish writer Charles Maturin, who wrote Melmoth the Wanderer in 1820. And the curious thing is that it was Michael Carreras, who was the Hammer producer responsible for The Man Who Could Cheat Death. And I suspect he was thinking of The Man Who Could Cheat Death in 1964 when he wrote and directed The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb for Hammer, which has a character played by Terence Morgan, who turns out to be the mummy's brother. Rather more extravagantly than Georges Bonnet, he has traversed thousands of years and is still a very well-preserved guy looking about 35 or 40. Yet another influence on Barry Lyndon was presumably the vogue for rejuvenation treatments that had swept the world in the 1920s. A doctor called Serge Voronoff was the proponent of monkey gland treatment. Somehow elderly men could be restored to skipping youth by the application of slivers of monkey testicles. Now, he was, by the time Voronov died in the early 50s, his theories had been very comprehensively rubbished and were mocked at, even in his obituaries, in the very same newspapers that had once embraced his theories so enthusiastically. Although nowadays there is a move to suggest that, wild and improbable though his theories seemed, they did form a kind of basis for hormone replacement therapy. But nevertheless, this mania for monkey glands and other forms of rejuvenation had an effect in Hollywood. There were all sorts of rejuvenation-type stories, generally revolving around women, because, traditionally women are expected to be more concerned with preserving their youth than men. So there were films like Black Oxen and The Young Diana. And the monkey gland theories even informed, an early Lon Chaney film called A Blind Bargain, in which he played a researcher and the researcher's strangely ape-like servant. And a very interesting thing about the film version that Paramount did in 1944 of The Man in Half Moon Street is that in the press book they made a great play of the fact that they had created for the Homo Immortalis' laboratory an exact replica of Voronov's 1920s laboratory. This despite the fact that Voronov was now a discredited figure. And another odd thing is that they changed the character, John Thackeray, into a character called Julian Carrel, which is awfully similar to a real-life scientist, a very important Nobel Prize-winning scientist who was fascinated by the whole question of aging and trying to reverse it, a scientist called Alexis Carrel. So, this character Thackeray just couldn't seem to hang on to one name, And of course, by the time Jimmy Sangster came down the pike, he's changed, for whatever reason, into Dr. Georges Bonnet, mainly, I guess, because they relocated the action to Paris. As was customary, Sangster's script for The Man in the Rue Noire was submitted pre-production to the British Board of Film Censors, and as was equally customary, the British Board of Film Censors had a few worries, as they put it, about the topic. One thing they particularly didn't want to see was the sculptures. Bonnet's sculptures, when they're revealed at the end, they didn't want a whole smorgasbord of busts, literally busts. They didn't want any of that. They were worried by the scene in which Janine was due to pose for him. And another thing they were particularly exercised about was the fact that when Bonnet, under the influence of degeneration, actually attacks his victims, particularly the one played by Delphi Lawrence, Margot, at the beginning, they did not want the sizzling sound effects that Sangster specified in the script. When the hand is clapped to Margot's face, they did not want the kind of sound. To be honest, I think those scenes work very effectively anyway without the sizzling sound effects. Those moments really are the highlights of the film, I guess, because The Man Who Could Cheat Death is unusual among Hammer films of the period, certainly among Sangster's scripts, in that there's an awful lot of talk. The fact that it's based on a play is fairly clear. There's one, when Dr. Weiss finally turns up from Vienna, I think we get 8 minutes of chat. I think briefly bisected by an appearance from Janine, though of course she too talks. So, this is just typical of a film that is very, very talky, so it relies very much on these big moments of Hammer horror. So if it's not entirely explicable that Bonnet has this effect on his victims, then we kind of excuse that, because these are the moments, that the paying customers have come to see. The opening of The Man Who Could Cheat Death is very effective. There's plenty of fog. There's Paris back streets constructed at Bray Studios. There's a little old guy divested of his euparathyroid gland. Of course, it's very much a kind of Jack the Ripper type scenario. And by 1971, Hammer would be doing very similar scenes in Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, which are much more explicitly Jack the Ripper, and of course much more explicit, plenty of blood about. But the whole iconography of a doctor on the hunt for glands or something with a doctor's bag and killing people in the fog was very, very Jack the Ripper. So really, this winds us straight back to Barry Lyndon, who, of course, having written his early successful plays, The Amazing Dr. Clitterhouse and The Man in Half Moon Street, went off to Hollywood and scripted one of the great Jack the Ripper films for John Brahm, The Lodger, and then scripted another John Brahm film really in a similar vein called Hangover Square. So, you know, the fact that there is this sort of Ripper vibe about the man who could cheat death is actually quite appropriate. The Georges Bonnet character, one of his first lines in this film is to Margot, his mistress, when he says, "Let's not think of other people, let's think of ourselves." There's something very self-centered about that remark, very self-absorbed, which really proves to be the keystone of his character. He's not very sympathetic. And Differing also gives a rather stagey performance. It's quite odd. Terence Fisher was a very good director of actors, but occasionally a rather unmediated performance would sort of get through the net. And Differing has a habit of going into emotional scenes and ignoring the person he's talking to, and as on a stage, delivering his lines literally out front, direct to the audience. One rather pleasantly kinky aspect of the story is Bonnet's hideaway near the Gare du Nord, where he keeps all the busts that he has made of his former mistresses over his very long life. In a sort of minor key, this reminds me a bit of Bluebeard's closet, don't open that door, because you'll see all the previous wives strung up and eviscerated. But I don't think really that Hammer quite capitalise on that sufficiently. The ending is rather rushed. And one of the very intriguing features of the ending is that the Margot character, very well played by Delphi Lawrence, turns out to still be alive. She's being kept, now having lost her wits from the horror of having the sizzling handprint attached to her face. She's become a lunatic, and she's kept among straw in a sort of little alcove in this place. And of course, Janine, having already been in the place for quite a long time, waiting for Bonnet to come back, finally hears the insane giggles and she meets the previous mistress. And how interesting it would have been if we could have seen the conversation between Janine and Margot, or had some kind of interaction between them, because obviously something interesting is going to happen there. Janine is obviously beginning to realise that Bonnet isn't the shining knight in armour that she thought he was, and then she finds a previous mistress, obviously, gone gaga and disfigured, kept, in a stable, effectively. So, there was an awfully interesting scene there, but we don't get it. And so as a result, Margot is really just reintroduced to giggle insanely and hopefully give people chills a bit that way. But mainly she's reintroduced to, for no particular reason, just to chuck a lantern. Sangster at this stage, in writing his Gothic horror films, did give rather short shrift to the female characters. And I think the criticisms of this came in even at the time. I think he was certainly quite stung by this criticism. And as a result, when he rather shifted away from Gothic in 1960 and inaugurated a series of black and white suspense thrillers, often very, very good suspense thrillers, he made a point of making women the focus of those films. Now, on one level, that's not such a revolutionary idea because, they're sort of founded on films like The Spiral Staircase and what have you. Of course, always the beleaguered heroine is the central figure of those films. But he did actually make an effort to make these parts playable and worth playing and worth attracting some quite big names like Susan Strasberg in the first one, Taste of Fear. I guess The Man Who Could Cheat Death has a bit of a paucity of the physical horror that Hammer had become well known for. And I think this is reflected in some of the critical estimates of the film that came out at the time. C.A. Lejeune of The Observer, along with Dilys Powell, she was, they were the twin queens of British film criticism at the time. And she had famously apologised to all decent Americans for sending them a work in such sickening bad taste as Dracula, the first Hammer Dracula. That was exactly the phrase she used. At the beginning of later in 1958, I should say, she was faced with The Revenge of Frankenstein, and said she wanted to, scrub off the experience of having seen the film with carbolic soap. Disgusted by it. By the time The Man Who Could Cheat Death comes around, and The Man Who Could Cheat Death, by the way, was released rather late. It was released a full year after it was made. When that one came around, she's a bit resigned and clearly less horrified than before, and so she takes a different tack. She just decides in her Observer review to pity the makers of these films. She actually says, what a terrible, lifeless, soul-destroying job it must be to make these hackneyed, cliche-ridden horror films. She actually referred to the film as a film in the H category, which is interesting because she was obviously a little bit behind the times there, because the H had been replaced by the X 8 years earlier. Jimmy Sangster professed himself not awfully impressed by the end results when he finally saw The Man Who Could Cheat Death, but, he was undaunted by this because it was a worthwhile venture, because somebody, he couldn't remember who, somebody asked him to write a novelisation, which he did, as he put it, in 2 weeks flat. And so, The Man Who Could Cheat Death came out from Ace Books in the UK, and Avon Books put it out in the US. There's a curious anomaly about this novelisation, in that the British version was credited to his usual nom de plume, which was John Sansom, whereas in America they credited the book to Barry Lyndon and Jimmy Sangster. Of course, Barry Lyndon had nothing to do with the novelisation, but it was interesting that in America they just came straight out with it and called him Jimmy Sangster.